This question, what would you have done during the civil rights movement, has been haunting me for years now. All of us who think of ourselves as anti-racist like to imagine we would have stood up for what was right and been out in the streets. But how many of us know the history well enough to know what the fight really entails? I didn't realize until recently that the Montgomery bus boycotts, for example, lasted over a year. I think often of these lines from Ilya Kaminsky's poem, We Lived Happily During the War. We protested, but not enough. We opposed them, but not enough. I was in my bed, around my bed, America was falling, invisible house by invisible house by invisible house. I took a chair outside and watched the sun. I feel indicted by this poem. I have protested, but not enough. I've given to mutual aid funds and bail funds, but not enough. I've read and I've taught anti-racist books, but it's not enough. When the Breonna Taylor and George Floyd protests began, I was reminded of one of the most powerful lessons I ever taught. I took a few days to walk my students through a close reading of Chapter 1 of Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. Now, I have to admit I have a fraught history with the book. I first read it in high school, and at the time I had a lot of unexamined racist beliefs. I remember thinking, there's like 2 black kids in the entire school. Why are we reading this black book? Isn't racism over?
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
Yeah, I was a sweet summer child. Invisible Man was probably the first book that I read that explicitly dealt with American racism, and it really should have helped open my eyes. But it didn't. In her article, What is an Anti-Racist Reading List For?, Lauren Michelle Jackson writes, I suppose the anti-racism reading list is exactly for that person who asks for it. And yet, the person who has to ask can hardly be trusted in a self-directed course of study, not if their yearning for gentle education also happens to coincide with their earliest exposure to books written by people who are not white. In my experience, even a directed study can fail to help someone develop an anti-racist consciousness if the works are not framed appropriately. The lessons Invisible Man had to offer were too harsh for me at that time. A gentle education it is not. Now, I don't remember anything about how the novel was framed or what lessons went along with the book. I don't remember my teacher helping us to read it closely at all. And to be honest, I actually hated it after reading it the first time. Now, I was lucky enough to get a chance to read it again in college. I'd learned a great deal between my first reading and my second, and I was finally ready to hear what it had to say. I'd begun to have my anti-racist awakening, a journey that I'm still on, and if Dr. Ibram X. Kendi is to be believed, it's a journey that I will be on for the rest of my life. I was blown away by Invisible Man the second time I read it. It is a beautiful book and one of the most densely packed texts I've ever read. It helped me understand American history and race relations in a way that I had not before. Now, the year I taught the close read of Invisible Man, all the books on my syllabus were about discrimination and man's inhumanity to man. I don't remember everything that I taught, but I know that I taught Night by Elie Wiesel, All American Boys by Jason Reynolds and Brendan Keeley, and Raisin in the Sun by Lorraine Hansberry. I think we might also have read Master Harold and the Boys by Athol Fugard, but I'm not entirely sure. I don't remember what inspired me to bring in the first chapter of Invisible Man, but I remember that you could hear a pin drop during those lessons. And I recently got an email from a former student who was in that class, and she let me know that I was the only teacher that she had had who took teaching race and racism in America seriously. Now, that doesn't valorize me. I think it condemns the teaching profession. We still have a lot of work that we need to do in our schools. So why am I doing this video series? I want to answer the call I hear in Lauren Michelle Jackson's essay for teachers to help guide people in developing their anti-racist consciousness through reading. Invisible Man is an important work of American literature, and it offers insights into America's race relations. Over the next 6 videos... I know. That's a lot, but I wanted to keep each video to about 20 minutes rather than just drop one 2-hour-long video. And the story divides neatly into 6 parts, which I'll call 1. Grandfather's Curse, 2. The Pre-Fight Entertainment, 3. The Battle Royal, 4. The Title Match, 5. The Rewards, and 6. The Speech and the Dream. In these videos, I will give you the framing of the novel that I did not get on my first reading, and I will show you how I read and interpret this chapter and what I think Ellison is trying to show us through his symbolic language. Am I going to address every nuance? No, I couldn't possibly address them all. I also know that I'm going to make mistakes, and I know that I'm going to miss some of the nuances. So, I invite you to add your thoughts and your interpretations to the comments below. Ellison began writing Invisible Man in 1945, and he took 5 years to write it. The first chapter was published separately as Battle Royal in 1947, and the completed novel was published in 1952. It won the National Book Award in 1953. The novel follows the unnamed narrator from the day after his high school graduation, through his college experience, his expulsion, his move to Harlem, and into his political activism for a rather cult-like political party. It has strong elements of the Bildungsroman, that genre of novel that's about someone's personal and spiritual growth. It interrogates individual identity and social identity within the racist politics of the United States of America, politics that persist until today. It also explores the idea of perception versus reality and challenges a lot of America's foundational texts and founding myths. The book is, as I said before, beautifully written and dense with symbolism. But I don't want to reduce it to just a book about racism. It is so much more than that. So anyone who wants to be a writer, or even just see what the English language can do, should read Invisible Man and sit with it. It is well worth your attention. A note on the language before we begin. The N-word appears 5 times in this chapter, and always from the mouths of white men. I refuse to say that word, and I don't want to show it on screen. So instead, you'll see and hear instead of my reading. I promise you I did not say the word while recording it, and there will be links to the raw audio of each section in the description below each part. And now, with that said, let's begin. I'm Owen Gray, and this is Interpretations. Chapter 1. It goes a long way back, some 20 years. All my life I had been looking for something, and everywhere I turned someone tried to tell me what it was. I accepted their answers too, though they were often in contradiction and even self-contradictory. Now, I want to pause here. In a cold reading, you might miss this point, but after reading and rereading this text, this line stands out as important. Throughout this chapter and the entire novel, there are going to be contradictions and self-contradictions. The narrator is telling us how to approach his narrative. Keep your eye open for contradictory and self-contradictory statements throughout the chapter. I was naive. I was looking for myself and asking everyone except myself questions which I, and only I, could answer. It took me a long time and much painful boomeranging of my expectations to achieve a realization everyone else appears to have been born with, that I am nobody but myself. But first I had to discover that I am an invisible man. And yet, I am no freak of nature, nor of history. I was in the cards, other things having been equal, or unequal, 85 years ago. I'm not ashamed of my grandparents for having been slaves. I'm only ashamed of myself for having at one time been ashamed. About 85 years ago, they were told that they were free, united with others of our country in everything pertaining to the common good, and, in everything social, separate like the fingers of the hand. And they believed it. They exulted in it. Again, let's pause here. Whenever an author repeats him or herself, you should take notice. There are 3 references to time in the first 2 paragraphs. Ellison is emphasizing the time setting. The novel was completed in 1950 and published in 1952. Let's assume that it's being narrated around the time of its publication. So it's being narrated in the late 1940s or early 1950s, and the narrator is remembering 20 years ago, so the late 1920s or the early 1930s. So we need to keep in mind what was going on in the 1920s and 1930s in the United States in this chapter. So we need to keep in mind the Jim Crow laws, Prohibition, and the Great Depression. He also references 85 years ago twice. He's not naming it, but it's clear from the clause, about 85 years ago they were told that they were free. He means the Emancipation Proclamation, which went into effect on January 1st, 1863. Now, 1863 plus 85 is 1948, which confirms our assumption that the novel is set contemporaneously to when it was published. And the last 2 sentences in this section, and they believed it, they exulted in it, deserve some attention too. I think the narrator is challenging the reader to not believe everything they are told or everything they read. The Emancipation Proclamation is an important document in American history, no doubt, but the narrator is challenging us about whether or not to believe it. After all, the most famous sentence of the Declaration of Independence states, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." It was penned by a man who held other men and women as slaves. The Constitution of the United States permitted slavery. We should also consider the fact that while the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution abolished chattel slavery as a private institution, it permits slavery and involuntary servitude as a punishment for crimes whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. So, I think the narrator is urging his reader to view the Emancipation Proclamation as another foundational myth of America that may have fallen short of its stated ideals. They stayed in their place, worked hard, and brought up my father to do the same. But my grandfather is the one. He was an odd old guy, my grandfather, and I'm told I take after him. It was he who caused the trouble. So whenever a character compares themselves to someone else, stop and take notice. His grandfather, quote, caused the trouble, so we can assume that the narrator will also cause trouble. Also, pay attention to the change in the verbs. In previous sentences, the narrator used active voice verbs, such as they exulted in it, they worked hard. But now it's a passive voice. I am told. Well, who tells him that? Who tells him he is like his grandfather? Presumably his family, but we need to hold assumptions cautiously until we have enough evidence from the text to support them. On his deathbed, he called my father to him and said, "Son, after I'm gone, I want you to keep up the good fight. I never told you, but our life is a war, and I have been a traitor all my born days, a spy in the enemy's country ever since I give up my gun back in the Reconstruction. Live with your head in the lion's mouth. I want you to overcome 'em with yeses, undermine 'em with grins, agree 'em to death and destruction. Let 'em swallow you till they vomit or bust wide open." They thought the old man had gone out of his mind. He'd been the meekest of men. The younger children were rushed from the room, the shades drawn, and the flame of the lamp turned so low that it sputtered on the wick like the old man's breathing. "Learn it to the young'uns," he whispered fiercely. Then he died. But my folks were more alarmed over his last words than over his dying. It was as though he had not died at all. His words caused so much anxiety. I read this as the narrator cluing us in that the grandfather's ghost is going to haunt the remainder of this chapter, if not the entire novel. I was warned emphatically to forget what he had said, and, indeed, this is the first time it has been mentioned outside the family circle. It had a tremendous effect upon me, however. I could never be sure of what he meant. It's sentences like these that I'm referring to when I pointed out at the beginning to pay attention to contradictory and self-contradictory statements. He was told to forget, but he has remembered. His grandfather's statement has had an effect on him and shaped his life, but he doesn't understand what it means. Grandfather had been a quiet old man who had never made any trouble, yet on his deathbed he had called himself a traitor and a spy, and he had spoken of his meekness as a dangerous activity. Here we see the second reference to meekness in the chapter. I can't see the word meek without thinking of a section of the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Matthew chapter 5, verse 5, New International Version. The narrator called into question the foundational texts of the United States earlier. Is he calling into question one of the foundational texts of Christianity here? It became a constant puzzle, which lay unanswered in the back of my mind. And whenever things went well for me, I remembered my grandfather and felt guilty and uncomfortable. It was as though I was carrying out his advice in spite of myself. And to make it worse, everyone loved me for it. I was praised by the most lily-white men of the town. I always tell my students to be very careful using the word everyone, and I am suspicious of it whenever I see it in a text. Now, often an author will reinforce or elaborate their point in subsequent sentences, so I cannot help interpret the word everyone as a synonym for the most lily-white men of the town. This shows a level of internalized white supremacy. I was considered an example of desirable conduct, just as my grandfather had been. Again, we have somewhat contradictory statements here. Also, I want to call your attention to the word considered. The narrator softens his own words. He doesn't say he was, he says he was considered. This builds towards the theme of appearance versus reality. This also alludes to the idea of the model minority or the credit to his race. Later we'll see in the chapter how the narrator has internalized these ideas and in fact looks down at other black teenagers. And what puzzled me was that the old man had defined it as treachery. When I was praised for my conduct, I felt a guilt that in some way I was doing something that was really against the wishes of the white folks. That, if they had understood, they would have desired me to act just the opposite. That I should have been sulky and mean, and that really would have been what they wanted, even though they were fooled and thought they wanted me to act as I did. It made me afraid that someday they would look upon me as a traitor, and I would be lost. Still, I was more afraid to act any other way, because they didn't like that at all. From this section, we can begin to see that the narrator has some level of double consciousness. He's aware of his actions, but he's also aware of how white people view his actions. He's walking on this tightrope of appearance versus reality. There's also some hints in this section that he's internalized some degree of the white supremacy of American society. He feels alienated from himself. His actions are constrained by the limits that white people have defined as acceptable. On my graduation day, I delivered an oration in which I showed that humility was the secret, indeed, the very essence of progress. Not that I believed this. How could I, remembering my grandfather? I only believed that it worked. It was a great success. I've always found these sentences kind of confusing. What does worked mean in this context? What is his definition of success here? We need to keep our timeline clear. He began writing this about a decade before the civil rights movement kicked off in 1954. So while we might be tempted to see humility as a reference to nonviolent protest and Martin Luther King Jr., this novel came out about 2 years before the Brown versus Board of Education ruling and 3 years before the Montgomery bus boycotts began and the murder of Emmett Till. So he's probably calling back to Booker T. Washington. Seems to be, on some level, that worked and success are about pacifying the white people rather than actually making progress. Everyone praised me, and I was invited to give the speech at a gathering of the town's leading white citizens. It was a triumph for our whole community. That's the end of Part 1, Grandfather's Curse. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like it if you liked it, and dislike it if you didn't. I look forward to reading and responding to your comments below. If you think someone would benefit from this reading or find it interesting, please share it on all of the social media platforms. Part 2 of this series is already up on my Patreon. Please check out patreon.com/owenxgray to watch it now, or come back next week to see it here. You can follow me on Twitter at twitter.com/owenxgray or on Facebook at facebook.com/owenxgray. Thank you again for watching, and until next time, keep interpreting.